Well, thank you for coming this morning. My name is Steve Jendrysik. I have had a lifelong interest in Westover Field. I still refer to it as Westover Field, which is what many people did. Although I was born in 1940, consequently I was just a little kid during World War II. But I lived my entire lifetime. I have been in connection with Westover Field. When I graduated from college, when I was a Boy Scout, we went up to the base. I've been on the base. So what I'm going to share with you today is the base, the story of Westover Field. And that story has to begin on a dusty afternoon in the summertime when a Polish immigrant named Tony Stonina paid $10 to take an airplane ride in a World War I Jenny over at the airport, you know, the one in Northampton. He went up for a ride. He was an alderman in Chicopee, 26-year-old alderman, and he wanted to look over the tobacco plains. Now, obviously, I'm going to refer to Westover tremendously as I go along, and I'm going to slip into these modes where I'm going to say the tobacco plains. You'll know what I'm talking about. That's what they call the field, up at the top of Route 33, the old Granby Road. It was flat. It was perfect. And here was an alderman. The following week at the Board of Aldermen in Chicopee, Massachusetts, Tony Stonina got up and proposed a municipal airport on Route 33. Well, they took one look, of course, back in 1926 and told him he was out of his head and said, we can't afford it, which was correct. And who needs an airfield in 1926? Of course, Lindbergh hadn't cleared the Atlantic yet. Lindbergh changed the whole dynamic about flying. But anyway, Tony Stonina went on to be elected mayor. In fact, he was elected on 3 occasions. He was the major political force of the 1930s, and he kept his little notebook, the notes he had taken with Will Sargent, the Jenny pilot from World War I. He told him this was the best possible site for a municipal airport anywhere in western Massachusetts, for that matter. So Tony had his little notebook in his pocket. The day that his planning director, Tony Pimentel, walked into the office and said that the War Department, and that's what we used to call it, by the way, we couldn't do that now, huh? Couldn't call it the War Department. Have to have a nice euphemism to describe them. But anyway, the War Department had announced that with the passage of the Wilcox Act, they were going to build a northeast airfield for the Army Air Corps. That airfield, of course, we're talking 1937. Trouble was already brewing in Europe with Hitler and what was going on there. But that was not the purpose of this. It was like the government, it was going to take several years. This was the first step. The Army Air Corps had to pick a site. And of course, Mr. Pimentel made the move. He was the planning director, and the mayor's secretary, Helen Roback, sent off the letter to the War Department saying Chicopee was interested in establishing, at least taking a shot at getting the location for this new airfield. What happens next, of course, is, and you folks are, certainly you understand politics plays a great role in all of this. And Chicopee was not exactly what you'd call a home run hitter in the politics of Western Mass. Holyoke, where we are today, and of course, and Springfield were far more influential. And obviously, my newspaper, my part-time job with the Springfield Republican, the Bowles family, owned an airport in Agawam, where the racetrack was. Remember, there used to be a horse track there too. They owned this property, lousy site for an airfield. But of course, don't forget, if anybody ever flown out of Logan, might be the genius who picked that airport. But anyway, the possibility that Springfield and the Agawam area would have a shot at this. And as luck would have it, And I'm a storyteller. All history teachers should be storytellers. If they're not, they shouldn't be propagandists. They should be storytellers. You know, they should be storytellers. God help us. I spent 40 years in the classroom, and the kids were great at comp. The minute Jendrysik said, you can close your notebooks, they knew we were off. And that was usually Friday afternoons for the special stories. But this is a great story. It could be made into a film. Stonina, was tilting at windmills like Don Quixote. I mean, an airfield in Chicopee, up on the tobacco fields. And since Dutch Master Cigars owned the whole place, Consolidated Tobacco, Sumatra, they owned a company called American Sumatra, which was you're familiar with the shade tobacco, that's what they sold. And they owned 3/4 of the tobacco plains, 7 miles, they owned it all. Or there were a few independent farmers too, who owned their own property. But by and large, they would be the great recipient. In fact, they would be paid $2.25 million by the federal government for the site. But that's coming ahead. Wait for the story. Dick Bailey, who worked for the Springfield Union, was a good friend of the mayor's. And one morning, he called up the mayor's office and he said to Helen Roback, the mayor's secretary, hey, are you people going down to the Sheridan Hotel? And I think it was the Kimball Towers and down on Chestnut Street. There's 3 Army generals here. They're eating breakfast in the lunchroom. 3 generals? Yeah, they're in their full gear and all their, with their, back in those days they had boots and everything else. I don't know, That was the Army Air Corps. They're here. And Helen said, the mayor doesn't know anything about this. He doesn't know they're here. Well, this guy was a character. There was no doubt about it. He immediately got on the horn, started making phone calls to several of his allies. And of course, since Tony Stonina owned the biggest car dealership in Chicopee, there were 3 Oldsmobile sedans parked out front, fully stashed with, potato chips and goodies, and also the liquid goodies. And they were off. They shot down Chestnut Street with 2 motorcycles in front. We had motorcycle cops in those days. 2 motorcycles and the 4 black Mariahs racing down. They weren't even invited. They walked in to into the vestibule of the hotel, and there they were standing there. Well, Tony Stonina, nothing slowed him down. Went right up to them, introduced himself, and said, I'm going to take you for a ride out. You don't need your vehicle. They're waiting out front. And they were taken aback. Who is this guy? I heard this story. I didn't make it up. Teddy Satella, who was the town historian for many years, told me that story. He said, we couldn't believe it. The people with him were, he just marched right up to him. Said, let's go. And they came. And the story, as they used to say on the radio, the rest is history. They went up to the tobacco plains. The first thing the general did, one of the generals got down on his hands and knees and started checking the dirt, for drainage. Here was a place, no elevation, less than 2 feet elevation. The whole place was perfect, absolutely perfect. Well, they did take a ride out to Bowles Airport afterward, pro-functa, take a look at this place. And they didn't really tell the mayor anything. He didn't ask them. But several weeks later, the mayor went on another excursion. They went down to Washington, D.C., and they had a meeting with Hap Arnold, who just, if you remember your World War II history, was commander of the Air Corps. Unfortunately, the mayor referred to him as captain. And Congressman Clayson, who's probably been in the background, Clayson said, don't tell him he's not a captain, But they got out of there. He said, don't before you call him a lieutenant. But they showed him. And of course, the great story was the elevation. And 100 miles from the coast, absolutely perfect location for transportation facilities, railroad, everything. This place was perfect. So there was really the political aspects to it slipped away rather quickly, because Tony, still like anyone, he was still hopeful, but they hadn't said anything. There was nobody gave him a clue what was going on. And of course, the world, as you know, in 1939 was going to hell in a handbasket. The war was inevitable. The American people were going to stay out of it, for sure. If those you know your history, the biggest organization in the country was called America First, and they weren't going to Europe again under any circumstances. You know, as a history teacher, I always talked about the common sense of the American people. They may not look that smart, but don't fool them, you know. And then, of course, there's the great story from Winston Churchill. And he was half American because his mother was Jenny Jerome from Brooklyn. And he'd say, well, the Americans will try everything, then they'll finally get it right. And that's a lot to that. But the plan to build the airfield was in the hands, of course, of the War Department. And, of course, there was a certain, I talked to a few people years back who said the mayor was confident, but he said Mayor Stonina was confident about everything. So who knows, you know? He thought he was going to win the election in 1939, and he didn't. But anyway, the day, it was, of course, 13 days after the outbreak of World War II. World War II broke out when, just like Putin, the Nazis reacted to Polish. The Poles were going to make war on them. We were creating an incident. Good God, you know. But that was the deal. On the 13th of September, the letter came in. And Tony was sitting at his desk, and Helen said, I never knew Helen, but I knew her late husband. And he started to cry. There it was. They'd done it. They were going to become the headquarters for the Northeast Air Force Base, Army Air Corps Base. And what did that mean? Well, it meant, of course, that eminent domain, Gary's in-laws, eminent domain. Now, it was so different. It was a wartime emergency without a war. And the government said, as of whatever it was, the 16th or the 18th, they own the land. It wasn't yours. Mr. McKinstry up at the farms his father lost a considerable amount of land there, the problem in Chicopee was, and we're familiar with that if we live around here, the actual assessments were way too low. The government was willing to give you 40% above your assessed value. But unfortunately, the assessed value for farmland was almost nothing. And you could go down to Hartford. Mr. McKinstry told me the story. Go down to Hartford and try your luck, hire a lawyer. Most people didn't. The land went to the government. And Consolidated Tobacco, Dutch Master, owned most of the farmland, $2 million. They got the most. The people who worked there lost their jobs. It was not good. It was very unpleasant. And there was an election. In those days, municipal elections were in December. The mayor was already pretty unpopular for some of the scandals of his administration, but he still suspected that in the end he was going to win. Well, astonishingly, he lost by 3,000 votes. I mean, this is a city which had 40,000 people in it in those days. I think 42,000 in 1939. He lost by 3,000 votes. I mean, he lost. He even almost lost the Polish wards. Because, you know, in those days, we had two political parties in Chicopee, the Polish and the French party. And the French won it. Leo Seneca won. And then he took a brilliant step. He made Tony Stonina the chairman of the city's aviation committee. Stonina never ran for office again. But anytime you'd bump into the mayor, he always managed to come around to the story of the base. And I was fascinated. I only talked to him a couple of times. I wish I'd sat down with him. And he got around to the base. He could never have predicted what was going to happen. None of us could have. I mean, the idea of a air base nearby, the vote, Stonina lost for a lot of reasons. But he lost, believe it or not, because of Westover. The people of Chicopee did not want the base. Mr. McKinstry, who just passed away recently, Al, he still was mad at the city for the way they were treated. But nobody realized it. This was the issue, the tipping point. You know, they said, this is it. And the vote, unpredictably, the new mayor inherited a city that was actually in good financial shape. Chicopee was in great shape. And if you're familiar, but I'm sure you had members of your family, by 1940, we were not in a war, but every factory in Chicopee was at war. My uncle worked at the aircraft down in Connecticut. They picked him up in front of the house on Hamden Street with a bus. They were busing guys down to Pratt & Whitney. Pratt had a huge contract. In 1938, 45 people were on Grove Street, and they got jobs at Fisk. Fisk got a terrific contract for military tires for the Brits. And they hired 50 guys right on the spot. If you had any background in tires, you had a job. Chicopee actually picked up. Never mind, I don't even get into General Instruments, Sickles, what was going on at Ames. Westover, Spalding was already making batteries for somebody. So the contracts, they were hiring. Things were looking up in Chicopee and around the whole region. This was a very highly industrialized region. But as far as going to war, the general opinion was that that war was none of our business. Hey, we stayed out of it for what? Almost 2 years. And the world was, I mean, you know, every day the newspapers and the newsreels were full of disasters. The Nazis were winning everywhere. The Japanese were seizing most of China. There's a great quote. I don't know if you remember a guy named Elmer Davis. Used to be on the radio. He was one of my father's favorite. Had a great Midwestern voice. Elmer Davis said on his broadcast, and I always used to tell my students, the American people don't give a hoot in a rain barrel for what's going on in China. Now, he was from Indiana. I don't know who hoots in rain barrels, but he actually became the head of the Public Information Service during World War II, and you know who worked for him? Dr. Seuss, when he wrote those terrible racist cartoons. If you've seen the job he did on the Japanese and Hitler. Yeah, Dr. Seuss worked for him down in Washington. When he took the job, Roosevelt told, "You'll do a great job," he said. He didn't want the job as information director because the guy during World War I, Creel, had turned out to be a disaster. It was basically, George Creel was not a nice man, and he was basically, you know, they closed down all free speech during World War I. They just shut it down. And Elmer Davis told the president, "I'm not going to do that," you know. And they didn't. They didn't. The role of the press in World War II was astonishing, really. Our press, the guys who traveled with the Army. So he did a good job, but a hoot in a rain barrel, I still have never found out what the hell that was. But hey, at least nobody was hooting in rain barrels. China was a mess. Chiang Kai-shek in China was an incredible crook, and we weren't going to go rescue him either. You know, remember that's when they had all the warlords were running China. You didn't know who was in charge. It's a little bit like we were talking about our present situation with the Ukraine. Exactly who's in charge here, but when the base came, the first thing that happened, of course, was they bought up the land, and then they started getting the money. And you were just talking about someone in your family that worked there. Obviously, the CCCs cleared the place. They actually, there was a CCC camp right up on the plains, top of Sheridan Street. They took the kids out, they cleaned out all the brush, cut down all the trees, and marched around. And I knew several people I interviewed worked with WPA. They put in all the roads. They did not build the biggest hangar in the world. That was built by an outfit out of New Jersey. And they put a foot of concrete down. And the guys who worked there, the kids especially, couldn't figure out what kind of an airplane needed a foot of concrete to land on. Well, the B-17 needed a foot of concrete to land on. They were building, and I've said it so often, they were building a super base here. They were not building anything anyone had ever seen before. And the chief of police, who used to live across the street from me, Buster Linehan, actually got a request from the Army if they had any of their officers could ride a horse. Honestly, we had a horse patrol. When they put up all the barriers and everything else, the horses would ride around Cooley Brook and to protect the base. The base they didn't shut the base down until about 6 months before Pearl Harbor. Then nobody could go in there. But at first we had B-17s, which were basically flying surveillance on the coast, looking for German submarines. And then, of course, the smaller planes came in. I don't know how much you know about what happened to the base's actual, what they call the mission of the base. Nobody was exactly quite sure because we were not in a war. We were ill-prepared, as you well know, for World War II. Militarily, we, within a short period of time, that changed, but not that quickly. The base was an example of how the mission of the Army Air Corps changed radically. What it changed to was a training base for pilots of B-24s, B-25s, crews, navigators, gunners. These guys, a lot of these guys, of course, had a couple of years of college. They were, and I drove by the War Memorial coming up here, and that was the biggest USO operation in Holyoke. Every Saturday night, that was the place to go. But you usually were an officer. The regular guys went down to the flats, They weren't going up to see the USO. We had 2 USO outfits in Chicopee, one at the community center, and a couple of the churches had them. And let me share one other story about why the mayor lost. And I was speaking at the Senior Citizens Group in Chicopee, and there were several ladies in the front row. And I was talking about the dances and how they met the flyboys, And one of the ladies she married one of the guys. They were sitting in front, and I got the story very quickly. The Nativity Church, the Monsignor, had gotten up in church on Sunday Mass and had told them that, he felt that the girls should be willing to go up to the base for the USO dances and so forth. So the Frenchmen were all waiting out in front with their cigarette butts, after Mass. He said, okay, Monsignor, you want to take the girls up to the base? You take them every Thursday, and you bring them back. Well, she married one of the guys from Oklahoma. And it's a great story. I still choke up. He picked her up on the way back from Europe. And she was back here. He'd passed away, and she was back in Olivenville. But it was a great story. But Chicopee did become a part of the war that way. But the base, here's the biggest story of the base was really never part of the city. The base was fighting a war. If you worked up there, it was a different story. But if you, there was no connection to Chicopee in Western Mass because the Air Force's mission was fast. The training was fast, everything was fast. They were operating a highly successful operation, but they weren't worried about relations with the local community. But most of the stories were very good. The base was considered a real asset, but nobody imagined what was going to happen afterward. I mean, no one could have predicted the Cold War, no way. But during the war, some of the places are still around. Mount Manning's over on James Street was a famous water hole for the airmen. But as the war went on, the base, of course, shifted gears and became more of a training base. They trained for the B-24s and B-25s. When the war ended, most Americans, including the people of Chicopee and Holyoke and western Massachusetts, assumed that the base would be available for development. And they had a big plan. It was called the Chicopee Plan. And it was the center of the plan was where Fairfield Mall was on Route 33, the center of Chicopee. They were going to build a tech high school, and there were all kinds of plans. Well, they all stopped dead in their tracks. It was an outfit called the Communists.
How many houses were taken?
Oh, not that many. Not that.
Mostly just farms?
Yeah, there was farmhouse.
Yeah.
There was no housing to speak of. I think it was like 26 or 27 actually, and maybe 100. It went up to 100 dwellings. I'd have to look it up. But in other words, don't forget, it took all the barns that Consolidated had and everything. Yeah. And anyway, when the war ended, everybody assumed it was the end. But as we well know, and I'm sure you people remember, it all changed. We now found ourselves in a situation where we were supporting Europe. Italy was on the brink of going communist. France was on the brink of going communist. Actually, Czechoslovakia went communist. They pushed Masaryk out the window. It was a horrible time. And the government of the United States was under as you know, the President of the United States was that demon necktie salesman, President by accident, Harry Truman. And he was without a doubt the most unpopular president probably in American history to ever get reelected. But he did. In 1948, Truman inherited a tremendous mess. The biggest mess, of course, was Germany. And of course, there I was in the 3rd grade at Valentine School making little parachutes to drop candy to the kids. We had a big sign as you walked into the school with the air routes, and I still remember it for a budding history teacher, the air routes into Tempelhof Airdrome. It was a time when the kids at Valentine School were part of a world crisis. What caused the crisis? Well, we had discovered that dealing with the Russians was impossible. But what happened? Why did we have the Berlin airlift? Because the Allies, the French, the Brits, and the Americans, decided to create the Federal Republic of Germany. That was part of it. Konrad Adenauer, an anti-Hitler German, would become the prime minister, and the Russians were stuck. They had a 2 million man army surrounding Berlin, and they were paying them in wartime script. All of a sudden, and I used to tell my students, the mark was back. The German mark, the strongest currency in Europe, had been reborn thanks to the French, the British, and the Americans, and Konrad Adenauer. And Stalin didn't know what to do. So what did he do? He closed the city of Berlin, the air routes. But he didn't figure on Harry Truman. And he didn't figure on Westover, because Westover was going to become the operational point for Operation Vittles. Westover at that time had just become part of the Military Air Transport Service, MATS. Probably some of you older folks remember MATS. They were C-54s, the hottest air. Oh, as a kid, the C-54 was the ultimate airplane. And we were in Boy Scouts, and they were lined up on the runway. These were the planes, of course, that would go to Europe to fly the Berlin airlift. And of course, the candy bomber just passed away. The guy who actually put the candies in the chute. Yeah, that squadron was from Westover. It's a great story. I still get, all history teachers are softies, but I am, I'll tell you. That's a great story. And he came to our school, and I was in the 3rd grade. And here he was out there. He brought a flag. He hung it up. What was his name? I can't, senior moment, but I'll think of it. That's awful. But anyhow, he came, and our 3rd grade teacher announced, Miss O'Keefe, I still remember her name, told us we couldn't go out. We had to sit in the window. You know, had the old school with the big windows. You got up on top of the. So we watched him. He was out there giving him the flag. He came to Chicopee, and Gail Halverstadt, yeah, he was from. He actually just passed away in Utah recently, 97, I think he was. Extraordinary man. The Germans, of course, who still weren't exactly much into us. There's a great book by Anton Chernot called The Candy Bombers. All of a sudden, the whole world changed for the Germans. The Americans who'd been bombing, all of a sudden, were flying tons of coal in every day to keep them warm in the winter. Finally, the Russians, of course, backed off on it. And I had an opportunity to interview several of the pilots. One of the guys, Bill Owen, and this is a little thing about Holyoke. When he was here, he was a World War II, what do you call it, C-47 pilot, and he went back in after the war. He and his wife lived up on Northampton Street when he was stationed at Westover, and he flew a C-54, and my son was living in Washington at the time. I happened to take a ride out to Dover, Delaware, because his C-54 is still parked there. And I interviewed the guy because he lived in Delaware at the time. It was his plane, and he described to me what a trip was going in. And he said, the Russians never buzzed me. I never saw any Russians trying to shoot me down. But he flew 147 missions into Berlin. Little guy, was about 5'5", yeah. What a hot shit. But those guys were something. And he said that eventually the Air Force, 1952, the birth of Strategic Air Command, and of course, their arrival here. These huge Boeing jets, they arrived when I was in junior high school, and I was in Boy Scouts, and we used to go up there. But when that first B-52 landed here in '56, you never saw anything like that. And those engines were all made by Pratt & Whitney. They were all Hamilton Standard engines, and they were here. And of course, their business, the great sign as you drove into the base, peace is our profession. You're looking at this thing, oh yeah, it's pretty peaceful, all right. But no, when we were in high school, Mike may remember, yeah, he's pretty old, Michael is. Right, Mike? No, he doesn't remember high school. No, not as old as me. There was down where the golf course is now in Chicopee, they had a place where you could, it was kind of just a drive-in place with some little fencing around it, where you could actually see the Westover runways. And you were quite a ways from the base. And of course, that was the place to take your girlfriend, if you wanted to scare the living hell out of her. Because when don't remember, it was called I'll think of it. Anyway, you could actually see them warming up the B-52s. But here, I thought the greatest thing I saw, anyway, was all of a sudden you're sitting in this incredible dark place, and all of a sudden the whole sky lit up. Everything lit up. This huge airplane had all kinds of lights on it, and of course they were warm. They were ready to go, and they were on instant alert all the time. They had 6 planes ready to go, and of course, where were they going? For years, I don't know if you thought about it or if you lived in Western Mass, where did they store the atomic bombs? Yeah. Right across from the jail, Stony Brook. And I got a letter from when I was chairman of the Historical Commission from some people who thought we should make Stony Brook, the reservation, a national landmark or something. The Air Force was not interested in doing that. So it's still there. So if you go out to the jail to visit some relatives or something, I hope you don't, but it's there. And it's on the other side of the fencing, and they were stored there through the whole time. And to be honest, we had kids that talked about it at Chicopee High School, but I never thought about it much. They have television shows and movies now about the Cold War. Did we really think about what might happen? Westover was the number 3 target on the East Coast. Hey, when we were in the in high school, the boys want to, if the Russians are coming, let's go out in behind the school and watch them drop the bomb. I mean, that sounds crazy. I used to tell my students, you can't. We were high school kids. High school kids are a little crazy. Let me tell you, hey, let's go out and watch them drop the bomb. I mean, they had all the secret, and if you were up at the base, of course, they had the spot where during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they developed all the film. That building is still there. The base was very much involved in everything that was going on in the era of the Cold War. And what did this mean for Chicopee and western Massachusetts? 20,000 people living up there. A yearly payroll of $60 million being pumped in. And a Chinese restaurant, how many of them were up Route 33, right? Hukilau arrived, But it was, for us, for the city of Chicopee and the western Massachusetts, a tremendous economic boom. And, of course, a front row seat on the big stories of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was happening out there. Now, Michael was talking about earlier about the crash. The KC-135, and I think it was June of 1958, went down right in Machowski's cornfield. Fortunately, none of the family was killed. All the people on board, including several newspaper reporters, were killed. They were going to break the speed record to London, England. They didn't make it over they just made it over the turnpike. They clipped the wires and went right into Machowski's cornfield. But other than that, probably the biggest stories, and I didn't get into them because with time permitting, was during World War II, how many pilots were and crews were injured flying when they were training. And it was a risky business. But the Strategic Air Command, these guys were, of course, the button-down members of a new generation of military people. The guys who flew were the parents of the kids I had at Comp. When they opened Comp, I was fortunate enough to get a job there and spent 40 years there. But the kids were great. We had almost 300 kids when we opened from Westover. They were educated, they were smart, and they also, anytime you said, has anybody ever been to Spain? Yeah, 3 or 4 of the kids had been stationed in Rhoda. They knew exactly where it was. And one kid described Rhine-Main, the big one in Germany. He was there for 5 years with his, And these kids were obviously, I have 3 granddaughters, and one just graduated in 2020 from the Naval Academy. This is my tie. And she's currently flying Poseidons in the Navy. Her mom, my daughter-in-law, was a jet pilot. My son was retired commander in the Navy, and my second granddaughter is now in a plebe at the United States Naval Academy. So we're kind of a Navy outfit. I never was in the service, but my son went to Annapolis, and now his 2 daughters have gone, and I don't know about the third one. She may go too. He's a heck of a soccer player. But these kids changed Comp into a very cosmopolitan school in a sense. And we had our principal, a wonderful man, our first principal, Mr. Ziemba, he and Mr. Fay at Chicopee High, when Mr. Fay was principal, used to always read the schools that the kids were going to school with, whether they were going to graduate, whether they were going to go to college. Well, Stanley stood up there at our first graduation where our kids were going. How many kids from Chicopee went to Oklahoma or Texas or the Air Force, the Naval Academy, no Air Force Academy yet. Now, he read them all for the graduation, and we were inside of the gym. It was 110 degrees in the shade. I think half the people died, but he read every single one. It was a proud day for us. But the school, of course, we were on the front lines of what was going on in the world. And not providing, and I always feel that It's not my job as a history teacher to try to tell you my story. I had an experience when I first started teaching. I went up to UMass to hear William L. Shirer. Does that name ring a bell? The rise and fall of the Third Reich. He was living up in Lenox. He was retired, and they advertised it, and we put a carload of guys from school to go up. We wanted to hear about the Nazis. Well, we got up there, and the place was really crowded at UMass. He came out, he was quite old, he was quite elderly already, and he spent the entire time dumping on General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, and the Republicans. And I mean, whatever your political views were, we had all come up to hear about Westover. Well, I mean, not Westover, we had come up to hear about the Second World War in Germany. This guy wrote the definitive book about the war. No, he didn't talk about it. So I said to myself, if I'm going to do this, what the paper said right here, that's what we're going to talk about. I'm not going to get off the track. And he just, and he was an older gentleman, he's rolling. What's he talking about? Some people actually got up and walked out. They didn't come to hear this, Maybe they were Republicans, I don't know. But so you learn something, right? You learn something by this. And I always try to stick to the point. I got a little off the track today because, I tend to do that. But Westover, of course, became much more controversial during Vietnam. The 99th Combat Wing was out in Anderson, out in Guam, and they were bombing. And I got to interview quite a few people. And each morning, the kids from UMass and Amherst and Smith would come down and get arrested. They would block the road into the place, and they would get arrested. And as I said, most of the other high schools around were engaged in protests and but they're right. Not at Comp. We didn't have any protests. The kids, it was not that we were, obviously their fathers were flying missions over Vietnam every day, but again, that wasn't so much it. It was just a different atmosphere. The place, of course, was part of the base. And the government had decided, if you get into a little detail for a minute, the government had decided that high school age youngsters should go to a public high school in the community they're stationed. They had two schools up at the base for the elementary kids, the junior high kids, but every morning, so the kids would tell me, yep, they would wait on College Street up in Fairview, all the protesters with their dressed up in all the protest outfits. They'd wait by Century Cleaners until the buses from the school for Comp took off, and then they would come out and block the road. See, they let the kids go to Comp every morning. So we got the report. And I had this kid, Les Zimmerman, I still remember him. His father was a jet pilot, and when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out, Les said, yep. He said, my father put on his sidearm and marched out of the house and said, we're going to get the Ruskies this time. But I think he was unusual. But every morning, we spent 10 minutes on what was going on. And I tried very hard to provide a balanced view of the whole thing. I, for one, am very proud of one thing, and I'm going to finish. I always finish up with this. At Chicopee Comp, when I was teaching there, one of the young ladies came up to me in class and said, do you mind if we write about you in the school paper? Well, they were going to have a survey of all the history teachers. Back then we had 8 history teachers, 8 or 9, and there were social studies teachers. I was never a social studies teacher. I was always a history teacher. I never quite became even though they had made me social studies supervisor. I'm a history teacher. Well, anyway, the young lady said, I said, sure, Well, she said, I'm not going to interview you. It's a survey. We're going to survey the students. Didn't tell me anything about it. So then the paper comes out, the once a month it came out, or once every couple of weeks, and there's a story on the front. I headlined the story. None of the students could figure out whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. They got mostly everybody else right, but not me. I was so proud of myself. I still am. I'm boasting about it. That was 20 years ago. But I was so proud of those kids. She said nobody I talked to could figure out. I'd start the morning off in my economics class with a 10-minute economic report of what's going on in the country. A little bit of like what Will Rogers used to do, you know. Will Rogers said whenever he needed a monologue for his performances at the Ziegfeld Follies, he just checked the Washington paper to see what the government was up to, what Congress did that day, and he had enough material for a good set of one-liners to keep the people in stitches. The other thing, going on a little bit of a little political thing, the front page of my paper, the Republican today, the story about Westfield. The underlying story of that is that the people that live in Westfield aren't too happy with Barnes Airport. Hey, my answer, come on to Chicopee. Did I talk about Colonel Bishop? Did I mention Colonel Bishop? No. Well, he was commander of the base for a while, but he was the PR officer. And I was up there because by the way, I was honorary base wing commander in 2015, the 75th anniversary of the base. That was a great experience. I had a lot of fun. Got to meet the head of the Air Force. Where? At Red Rose. They had a pizza thing, and the base commander called me and my wife up. Said, "What are you doing Saturday night? Having a big get together." The head of the Air Force commander, whatever, he was from California. Knowlton was his name. Yeah, I sat with him. 10 to 0, got the whole story of Westover. Yeah, but it was a fun experience, and what was I had to finish up, but anyway, when that came out, I really watched myself when I started talking about what was going on in the government. I think the understanding of this kind of a job, a government job, any kind of government position, is a tricky business in a society like ours, and it was. Going back where I started, Tony Stonina, he thought for sure he was going to get reelected. What happened? For him, of course, it was the best thing that ever happened to him. All he ever talked about was the base from then on, and he deserved it. But the base, of course, when probably my basic memory of how that relationship with the base changed, as Colonel Bishop told me, when they were having problems with noise at the base, a lot of complaints. But he said, let me tell you, Steve, he said, nobody from Chicopee ever calls up to complain. If you've ever played golf at the Chicopee Country Club, on the second hole, the C5A comes right over the tee. Yeah, don't tell, every time when I take people up there to play golf, I just hope one of those planes goes over. You can wave to the pilot.
That's nothing compared to the B-52.
Oh no, the B-52s.
They rattle the windows.
Well, we were talking about Page's Drugstore up on East Street. They never got any money for that. Every time they broke the sound barrier, they blew out the windows. And he was trying to, he hired a lawyer and everything. The Air Force told him to go fly it. But back in those days, anyway. One more Air Force story that we hear so much about environmental, and that's what's the problem for them up at Westfield, is that they've got some real problems with that place. But back in the 50s, Eisenhower signed an executive order, whatever, and they built a pipeline from New Haven to Westover. And what does that pipeline carry?
Jet fuel.
Jet fuel. How did we learn about it? During Desert Storm. They were backing up traffic for McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey with the refining trucks because they were. Somebody said, "How come Westover doesn't have any?" They just built it. You know, we needed it. It was a national emergency, so they put a pipeline through your basement.
When
But
was that done?
that was done it was Eisenhower did it, so it was in the 50s. Yeah, 50s. I would think right after Strategic Air Command came, because Strategic Air Command had to use they had a special mixture of fuel. They were flying, like you said, they were flying something else. But those guys, when the military, we had one great crash, that was in 58, and other than that, it's amazing the amount of times. But that second hole at Chicopee, you stand up there and there he is. You look up and there they come right over the green is out there and they're coming right in, depending on which runway they're using. But it's a connection that has turned into a home run for the whole region. And the relationship since we went, well, this is what they gave me for being base commander. Yeah, this was the change when in 1974, when they announced this. I always finish with this. I want to let you know that the Air Force did not close Westover and did not move 8th Air Force out because of Nixon. Because Nixon lost the election. Remember, in 1972, everybody voted for Nixon but Massachusetts, which he actually got more votes here than anybody else, but it was whatever. McGovern. Yeah, McGovern. And of course, our resident political party, the Democrats, announced that Nixon was getting even. Well, my students walked in the first day. After that was in the front page, Teddy Kennedy, front page story. They said, what's he talking about? We're all moving to North Dakota, and that's the next part of my story. You'll notice my elder son teaches at the University of North Dakota, and that's where they were going. They were going to Grand Forks, North Dakota. They were moving the B-52s into the center of the country because Russian nuclear submarines could have pushed a button and taken the base that's why they pulled out of there. And one kid came in and he said, it's been on the books. My father told me about that last year, that we're going somewhere because they're getting out of here. And so my son started first year when he was teaching at the University of North Dakota, his secretary, a young gal, well, not a young gal by then, she remembered the kids from comp. Oh yeah, she said. It was great. They had a couple of pretty good football players. I guess they made additions to the team immediately, but they moved to North Dakota to be in the center of the country, a few miles from where we have all the rockets. Now, and what's the name of that? Minot? That's where the rockets are. Yeah.
So in other words, Westover became too vulnerable to the Russians?
Yeah. No, that was the real reason. Yeah. That plan, basically, so it was going to close. All of a sudden, the real estate boys and, oh boy, here we go. Cut it out. I told my students, we got the biggest runways in the Northeast. We're going to become a municipal airport, just like Tony Stonina wanted. No.
You could land the space shuttle there.
Yeah, they did. They landed the SST there a couple of times when it couldn't land in New York. Yeah. It looked like, I think they landed. Yep, it looked like when it landed, it looked like a bug, but it looked like a bug because they had the pictures. Yeah, but anyway, obviously they were not going to give up a facility like this. But does anybody remember a gal named Ella Grasso?
Yeah.
Governor of Connecticut. She called up the then governor, whose name escapes me, the Republican, and they had breakfast at her house. And the Connecticut State Assembly appropriated $50 million to upgrade what? Bradley Field. Democrats and Republicans worked together. They weren't going to lose Bradley Field to Westover. And they didn't. Because, again, what happened was it's now the biggest reserve base in the country. They're all up there. The Navy's up there. The Army's up there. Everybody's up there. Yeah. They have training centers. That's all. They've moved. They've closed down all the other facilities, and they're centered there. And of course, Congressman Neal just announced they're going to be repairing all the C5s there. It's a big operation. They got about when I was base commander there for a while, wing commander, I got to meet those guys. A lot of guys from New York State, a lot of guys from New Jersey, all pilots. This is our reserve of trained pilots. In fact, Matt Lodra, who graduated from Comp, lives in Long Meadow. He was flying B-52s, and he's still flying here at the Galaxy. For them, it's not a part-time job. That we have. That's the base itself. Mission changes, but the other thing the base did was become a very part of the community. The Air Force wanted the base to become a part of the community, and that's why they hired me to promote the place. But not really. It's an extraordinary thing, and it happened because of Tony Stonina. That's why it happened. You know, he was a one-man band. But just imagine, I used to tell my students, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall that day when those three black Oldsmobiles pulled up in front and with the motorcycles and took off. That was a historic moment for the city, thanks to a guy named Dick Bailey, who was the Chicopee correspondent for the Springfield Union. I lived around the corner from me on Rimont Avenue. He made the call, and that swung them into action. These guys got to see the gym that was up on top of that hill. And when they left, the industrial park, they've got 2 industrial parks up there. They took all the old housing and turned it into, and the base is still there. It's only a shadow of itself. But when I was in high school, you could actually drive on the base. You can go pick a girl up go down to what they called Hollywood Boulevard, where the generals all were. Yeah, they're talking about doing something. Yeah, they lived right near the base. Yeah, you could drive right on. No security, no nothing. You were just a high school kid. You're picking up so and so. I think we had to stop. The girl had to show her ID when we were getting back in. Yeah. But it was really something, and we were proud of it. We were proud of our connection, and the other thing about Chicopee and the entire valley, they claim, whether this is true or not, that a lot of kids, of course, decided to go with the Air Force because it was right here, and especially if you were around the second hole and you watched them come in right over you. Thank you very much for coming. If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Just a little off topic, but
That's okay.
I have an interest in jazz. And I've learned a lot through area musicians that the Westover base had a nightclub that brought in a lot of people who are now, Ray Charles among others.
But not only that, in my book about in the 40s, I met a gal named Helen Katovich, who actually sang with the Westover Band. I'm going back to World War II. They had their own band, and the lead singer used to sing with Xavier Cugat. Oh yeah, and her boss, Helen, was just a clerk from Willimantic. Heard that she had sang in church and she was a good singer, and he said, "Look," he said, "tomorrow morning they're having tryouts." So I got to interview her. Her picture is in the book. She just passed away a couple of years ago. Yeah, there was. I don't know if there wasn't so much a nightclub, but that I don't know much about that. But the Westover Band was full of professional musicians. And what she did is they traveled all over New England performing in hospitals, military hospitals. Yeah, she was a neat lady. But I don't know. They said there was a nightclub on the base.
Yeah. No, I know any number of musicians.
The Officers Club was quite.
Yep, who have mentioned Westover as a place that was part of the itinerary.
Yeah. Now it's the NCO Club, but back then it was the Officers Club. Yeah. Now the base. The other thing about the base, and I'm a golfer, so back in the 70s, the early 70s, the late 60s, they had a base commander who was a golfer, and he vowed to build the golf course. The Ludlow, it's in Ludlow now.
Still pretty nice.
Yeah, pretty tough. 3, what do you call it, dog legs. Anyway, yeah. So he said that we're going to have the military championships there, and he did it. They built the air, and then of course you'd go there and they'd have airmen, enlisted men picking up papers and stuff, taking care of the place. But they actually had the entire Air Force. All services championships were there for the golfers. Yeah, it's what he wanted to do. So, Ludlow got a golf course.
I have a question.
That's what came out of it.
I know that in Westfield, that airport partners with the Westfield Vocational High School, and they offer like training for high school kids.
Yeah.
Does Westover do that?
No.
Anything?
No. In fact, that sounds like sounds like a former student of mine, not student, former teacher that worked for me. Yes, Steph Zaporowski. He's the superintendent of schools in Westfield now, and he actually did some work with Voc Tech when he was and his. This is going to sound awfully like nepotism. Another guy that I hired, who just happens to have the same last name as me, is now the principal of Westfield High School. And the last kid I hired, a kid named named Strykowski, is now the vice principal of Westfield. Have you got to notice here that the guys from Comp are? I told Mike Pease on the school committee, he wasn't too happy. He said, all your guys are headed. But Steph said, yeah, it sounds like something Steph would do. Yeah, because he actually did some work with the Voc Tech program at Comp. Yeah, but no, the base doesn't do that much outreach because of the way they operate. One of the great exciting moments is Thursday afternoons if they're flying. If the wing is flying, the cars start rolling in. You should see the cars these guys drive. You can guess what they do for what their part-time job is. Nobody's got a Toyota station wagon, that's for sure. Well, the extra money, the flight money must have something to do with it. I got a chance to sit with a couple of those guys, a couple of school teachers from New Jersey. They come in together all the time. Yeah, and they, as I said, my granddaughter is, as I speak, on her way to Mayport in Jacksonville, where she's going to start flying Poseidons. Yeah. That's the little girl that used to run around North Island with us. Yes, ma'am.
Can you just speak to what goes on at Westfield now? I mean, what kinds of...
No, Westfield is a state facility. That's the National Guard.
Sorry.
Oh, what goes on at Westover now?
Yeah.
Well, it's basically C-5As, and the C-5s, the big airplanes.
Do they transport things? Do they...
Yeah.
Are they storage or...
Well, as you know, I'd have to go. The mission when they first started was humanitarian. They were flying all over the country, the globe, rescuing people, and also that's when General Walker was there. Now it's similar. They are those basic planes. What can you see them? They can drive full-size trucks right inside of them. Yeah, tanks. Yeah, they're not involved with. I'm surprised. They were very much involved with Desert Storm, but not. I don't think they're doing anything with the Ukraine. I would think it would be a very risky thing to have those planes flying around today. But I don't know. But back then, during Desert Storm, Westover was, because my cousin's boy came back from Desert Storm, and they had those welcome at the base. That was really cool. It was really cool. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they're up to, but basically right now they're shifting to a new airplane. They have a. But the big discussion with with Westfield, as I understand it from today's paper, it's the plane. The military, the Air Force tried to build a multi-purpose fighter, and it's been a questionable airplane. So they may be getting that plane. That's what I've got it written. I didn't write it down. It's a 50th. Oh, anyway, it's a multi-purpose plane that can do a lot of things, and it will replace the planes they've got there now are pretty old, but that's the National Guard, and they're under state aegis. Believe it or not, Baker's technically still in charge of the National Guard. Well, one of the things when I was in school, when we got involved, remember the Berlin crisis when Jack Kennedy came in, and they called up 2 National Guard units, the Yankee Division from Massachusetts and the Screaming Eagles from Texas. The fact that Lyndon Johnson was vice president from Texas and President Kennedy was from Massachusetts, so several of my buddies ended up in Germany. And Kenny Williamson, in fact. And all he did was every weekend, Kenny was engaged. In fact, they had to postpone their wedding because he had to go. They would have a trip, to Mad Ludwig's castle. He said, I went all over Germany. I said, boy, what a war. You really was tough. Where are we going? And the charges were pretty moderate, for these trips. But he remembered Mad Ludwig's castle. He said, what a place. But that was what they did. But anytime there was any type of crisis, usually we're involved. This is a whole different situation, this thing. I don't talk about it. I don't know what we're doing. It's kind of scary. But, and as I say, my son and daughter-in-law are retired now, so I don't get any of the inside dope. Although my brother worked for the State Department, and call him up in Florida. But I don't know. I don't know how this is going to turn out. I just hope, being a Polish American, I just hope we help the Poles pay for what's happening in their country. How are they going to take care of these people? And if you know anything, I don't know what your ethnic background is, but we don't really like the Ukrainians. The Poles don't like the Ukrainians. Oh, are you kidding? But they hate the Russians a lot more. So, it's a matter. Yeah, the Ukes. Yeah, or the Lats for that matter. Central Europe, as a history teacher, is tough. I talked about it a lot only because of my Polish connection and my involvement with Poland. But yeah, my favorite story, we went to Poland in 2006, and the Poles are droll. They closed down the headquarters for the KGB, the Russian secret police, and they sold the building to the Bank of America. And then they turned it into what do you call it? The stock exchange. The Polish stock exchange is in the communist headquarters. Thank you very much for coming.